Okay, guys, let's talk spoilers for Spider-Man No Way Home. I'm actually going to try and do this without speaking too loudly, so I don't want to get too excited talking about this, because there's people in my house that have still not seen this movie, and the walls are thinner than I think sometimes. My wife sometimes talks about hearing what I say while I'm recording now and then as she's working in the office next door. Anyway, so yeah, let's start talking about stuff. First, the lineup of villains in this one from previous Spider-Man films: Doc Ock, the Lizard, Sandman, Electro, and Green Goblin. And it was so cool just to see how much time they were given. I mean, so much of this movie was given to characters and actors performing them again from previous Spider-Man franchises, not just films in this series. I think it was in some ways an effective shortcut to get to almost the Sinister Six. I mean, there are only 5 of them, I think, that I count. But I feel like in the other Spider-Man movies, like, they petered out before they had a chance to get to Sinister Six. And yeah, both the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield Spider-Mans, they petered out and just started to underperform. I mean, both of those franchises were canceled. As fondly as the Maguire, Sam Raimi Spider-Mans are remembered, that last one had some issues that kind of soured people, I think, to the idea of a fourth one. And so they would have kept making them if audiences would have kept loving them. They would have kept making them with those actors. So anyway, how do you do that then? How do you build up to a Sinister Six without rushing your investment in at least some of them, you know? And I think that at one point, I think they were talking about, before the MCU reboot, I think I remember them talking about spin-offs of that maybe featured villains. Maybe that was just Venom. Anyway, I think this is probably the most realistic way you could get a Sinister Six type of story, by pulling from movies that featured these villains in the past, so that we had, as audience members, provided we watched those movies, a prior investment leading up to this, bringing them all together, you know, without them having to start all over from scratch. So I think in some ways it was kind of clever, specifically to try and give us a Sinister Six type of thing. Okay, so Aunt May dying. I felt like before she died, first off, when the glider hit her, I jolted. I was like, oh my gosh, she's dead. She's dead. And then when she got up and started talking and stuff, and she was like, oh, I just got knocked down and stuff, and I was like, part of me didn't like it when she got up, because I was like, that would have killed anybody else. How can you explain to me that didn't kill her, But I mean, we find out moments later that it actually did. She suffered a wound she hadn't realized yet. And before we realized that she was dying, she said that line about power and responsibility that it felt unearned to me. It felt like, well, we haven't said this famous Spider-Man line in the past in these MCU movies yet. We got to get this in there. We got to make this point. We skipped Uncle Ben, which I still think, I understand why they were motivated to do it, because it had been so recent that the Andrew Garfield movies had told that story. But honestly, I didn't mind seeing that story again. I thought it was valuable to see again in the Andrew Garfield movies, and I think it would have been valuable to see again in the MCU, and we never got it. We never got it. And so them doing it here, they're kind of, I guess, trying to make Aunt May his Uncle Ben, but it felt forced to me, since, it felt forced to me. I wanted more investment in his relationship with Aunt May leading up to her death. Yes, there was good investment with her in the previous movies, but a lot of those were comedic scenes too, with her and Happy Hogan, or other kind of comedic, funny things going on. Having just watched the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man movies leading up to this one, I was struck again at Sally Field's performance as Aunt May, and just that was some freaking, man, that might be the best acting I've ever seen from like that many cast members in a superhero movie. So if you haven't watched those, or maybe they weren't what you expected, and so you're like, you were soured on them, maybe give them another try. Maybe you'll want to after seeing this movie. But I love those movies, especially Amazing Spider-Man 2. And so there was just great emotional investment and connection between Aunt May and Peter in those movies, and it was just felt absent here comparatively. Maybe even not comparatively, just felt absent in a lot of ways, especially in this movie. I wanted him to reestablish, remind me of the connection that he has to Aunt May before you kill her, so that to help me feel what he's losing, to help me know what this means to him to lose Aunt May. And they didn't invest in that in this movie, and so I didn't feel it near as much as I think I would have otherwise. The memory wipe at the end, it's interesting. I think it was one of many things that seemed designed to reset this Spider-Man franchise. At this point, it could continue in the MCU or not. And as many fans are aware, this is not properly a Marvel movie. It's it's a partnership between Marvel and Sony. I think they're Sony movies that are kind of licensing the MCU. And MCU properties as they make them, or there's some kind of arrangement like that. And there was a big stink 1 or 2 years ago, I think it was while this movie was still in pre-production maybe, where they were talking about disconnecting Spider-Man from the MCU going forward. And fans hated that, and I was one of them. I was like, if you guys do this at this point, while these other actors that are playing major characters like Iron Man and Captain America are aging out, you've got to have Spider-Man as the glue that holds together the MCU, and so that was a big deal. So when they were able to come to an agreement and keep him in the MCU, I was very happy about that. But going forward, I felt like, well, that could happen again. There could be another stink. There could be all kinds of money stuff going on behind the scenes with Suits that could result in a separation of these two entities again. And I think that they are positioning Spider-Man to be able to do that if they want to. Either to allow him to be separated from the MCU, because at the end of this movie, he's not, technically, it's not very clear that he is no longer in the MCU. But I think that with all the multiverse stuff or whatever, they could shrug and say, yeah, everybody forgot, but there was also a new timeline started that isolated him from the MCU at that point. I mean, they could do all kinds of stuff. But effectively, even if it's just a memory thing, effectively, he is very segregated from the rest of the MCU at this point. Now, in a follow-up Spider-Man movie, they could begin to correct that, or in other Marvel movies, they could begin to correct that and restore memory of Peter Parker to other people. Or they could just quietly stop mentioning Spider-Man altogether in MCU movies. And Spider-Man movies could quietly stop referencing other MCU stuff and keep them separated, so that only in our headcanon are they still sharing a single continuity, So I think that this kind of house cleaning that they were doing, think about it. They got rid of Aunt May, and they got rid of his connection to Tony Stark and to Happy Hogan. That's gone now. And so he is positioned right now so that Sony can either choose to separate him from the MCU or, in the boardroom, threaten to do so, giving them a powerful bargaining tool, saying, hey, he's perfectly positioned right now to just be separate from the MCU. We are content to do that, and they will not be able to call Sony's bluff, if indeed that would even be a bluff at this point. So I suspect that's a lot of what these choices were about. Let's see. Letting MJ and Ned forget at the end. Spider-Man, Peter Parker goes into the diner, talks to Mary Jane, has a whole speech prepared, and then he ultimately puts it away. He sees the Band-Aid on her head. What are we supposed to think about that? I think that we're supposed to consider that Peter at that moment is realizing she got hurt because of me. And now look, she's recovering from this injury. She's not in danger right now. She and Ned are going to the college they really wanted to go to. Maybe it's better if I'm not a part of their lives. I think that again, that could be where they absolutely are not going to go. But they left it in a place where if they wanted to, set aside MJ and Ned at this point, they could do it without looking back. It would not affect stories going forward. He could have an entirely new supporting cast. He could even, I think this would be a very controversial move, I think a lot of fans would actually hate it, he could actually gain a new love interest, even one named Mary Jane. That's the more traditional look of Mary Jane and stuff, and the way she's written, as opposed to, especially this MJ started out as kind of like a very dour goth, almost goth kind of like girl or something. Not in terms of her appearance, but just in her flat, sarcastic, dark attitude, which she's still retained, but she's certainly also brightened up and shown a softer side in these last two movies. But I mean, they could totally reset and give him a more traditional Mary Jane. I think people would hate that, but I mean, they could if they want to. So again, they could threaten that, let's see here. So yeah, they could have a totally new supporting cast going forward. They're definitely leaving space to just redefine who Spider-Man is, what these movies are going to be about. Almost kind of a fresh start for him. I mean, he starts out in a crummy apartment. He's not living at home with Aunt May anymore. She's completely out of the picture. He doesn't have the backing of Tony Stark and Tony Stark's tech or anything related to Tony Stark. And at the end, he swings out with a classic looking costume that I don't know if I would put up with, if he was wearing that a whole movie, But I think in some ways it reflects that he's really in a DIY mode. He does not have any of the resources that he once had. I mean, they gave lip service to the fact that he's broke and stuff and financial troubles, he and Aunt May and stuff, but those were footnotes almost. It did not feel like he was really struggling in the way that Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker was in the Sam Raimi movies when he, moved out and moved into the city and stuff. And so I think we could be seeing a return to that, like the 20-something out on his own for the first time, single adult, young adult Peter Parker. He hasn't done anything with photography up to this point. I wonder if he could end up doing something like that. There was a textbook that was about him taking prepping to take his GED, which says to me, oh my gosh. Of course, they don't remember him at Midtown Science. So he doesn't have this prestigious high school that he graduated from to say, hey, I'm really good with science. No, he's got to probably figure out how to get a social security number now because no one remembers him. So he probably has to figure out some way to get a social security number and to take his GED, so he can have a high school diploma. So he is really starting without any of the advantages that he might have had previously. I am ready for this. I'm ready for this Spider-Man. I think that in order for him to have longevity, we do have to reset the status quo and show him in a new stage of life. When I saw how young they cast him and realized, oh, we're going to get probably at least 2 movies, maybe 3 as turned out to be the case, of high school Spider-Man. But eventually, apart from the Ultimate Marvel Universe reboot, Spider-Man grew up, and probably most of his comics history now is not in high school, but is college or 20-something, kind of life. And so this is going to be the stage of life going forward that I think a lot of people are especially familiar with. So he's going to be down on his luck. Real financial struggles, low tech. All he had was a cell phone and an app to kind of try and keep track of crime. He's got no man in the chair. He's got no cool gadgets. He is freaking DIY superheroing. I mean, it's going to be a struggle for him to just figure out how to make his web fluid with the resources that he has. So I am really looking forward to that phase in Spider-Man's existence going forward, assuming they go in that direction, and I hope they do, because I think it's time. I think it's time for that. Okay, let's talk about Andrew Garfield, and just how much I appreciated them reminding us, carrying forward the death of Gwen Stacy, and just the tragedy of that still resonating with him now, was wonderful that they respected that story, and mentioned it, kind of not teased it, but kind of referenced it very lightly leading up to the moment where he rescues MJ. And he had said prior to that moment that when he lost Gwen, and he just briefly explains, and it says it all in just a few words, she was my MJ, And I'm like, yeah, dude. Yeah. In fact, she was far more to him than MJ is to the Tom Holland Spider-Man. She was far more. And so to have this moment where MJ is falling, I welled up with tears in the theater. And when MJ is falling and we see him there, and I just watched Amazing Spider-Man 2 2 nights ago. I just watched it again. So it was real fresh in my mind. And they show the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man seeing her falling, and it's like they didn't flash back and show footage from Amazing Spider-Man 2, but there was enough about that shot, the slow motion, all the debris getting in the way as he's reaching out and trying to dive for her. It was a wonderful, wonderful moment that that kind of allows for this great catharsis. You know, of course, it doesn't rescue his Gwen, you know, and of course, it wasn't his fault that Gwen Stacy died. She was emphatic about that in Amazing Spider-Man, saying before the climactic scene, even though he tried so hard to keep her away, she was like, no, this is my choice, and you need to respect my choices. And so he did, you know. And so that was her choice to put herself in that situation, and he did everything he could, was not able to save her. It's not his fault. Of course we can understand him blaming himself. And so it's just a beautiful moment when he rescues MJ, realizing who this person is, at least in theory, to this world's Spider-Man. And, you know, that what he must have been feeling like, I couldn't save my Gwen. I'm so glad I could save this woman for him. You know, oh, beautiful, beautiful. It was powerfully emotional, and thankfully they didn't go too quick to a joke after that. I still could have spent a few more moments there because I am much more emotionally invested in the Amazing Spider-Man films than in the Tom Holland films. But anyway, yeah, it was, what a great moment. A beautiful continuation of his story and further closure to it. Really, really loved how they honored that. And they wouldn't have had to do that. I mean, well, having him in the movie to begin with, you know, was a big deal. Those movies, if I remember correctly, they did not actually not continue because the box office failed or because they were received with mixed, you know, they had a mixed reception. I think there was a rights thing that was going on at the time. I could be wrong. I think it was kind of multiple reasons. It wasn't a cut and dried like, oh, people didn't like this. I think a lot of people probably assume that because it did get a mixed reception and then we didn't get a third one, you know. But I appreciated that the filmmakers of this movie, they respected the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies, and not only that, but the story that they were telling, the things they were emphasizing, the most valuable parts of that. They just had clearly, it seemed clearly to me that they had a love for that story, and so they wanted to honor it and even continue it or lift it up or highlight it in some way. It was just beautiful, respectful thing for them to do. Really, as a fan, really appreciated that. With Tobey Maguire, I'm not near as connected. That's the trilogy at this point that I'm least connected to of the Spider-Man franchises. But they did have a nice moment where they brought in Danny Elfman's theme for Tobey Maguire, and I think I'm trying to remember. Actually, I was just distracted because I was thinking, am I being too loud? My wife might be next door. I think I might have said Tobey Maguire too loud. Anyway, so yeah, gosh, let me find my notes here. Sorry. So yeah, they used the Danny Elfman theme. I don't remember if they did for Andrew Garfield or not. I don't know the theme well enough for the Amazing Spider-Man. I don't think it was as pronounced either. I love how they retained Tobey Maguire's nerdy awkwardness version of Peter Parker. There was this great line where they were like, something about, like, before the three Spider-Mans went out to do this plan, they're like, we're going to go kick some ass, you know? And then in this very, like, naive and awkward way, Maguire's Peter says, we're going to cure some ass, you know? I was like, that is such a weird, dorky thing to say. So cheesy. And I was like, that's just a wonderful, again, love letter to who that character was, how he was portrayed, how he was written, the feel of those movies. It was like they could have. I really suspected that all they were going to do, if anything, was have maybe one, maybe both of these two Spider-Man actors come back and just kind of have a brief scene. And they would be in it, you know, for maybe 10 minutes of the movie. But man, once they came on the scene, this movie could have been retitled Spider-Man, you know? I mean, yes, certainly Holland's Spider-Man had the dominant focus, but they gave so much focus I wouldn't have expected to these other two Spider-Men, and reviving and recalling. I mean, it was more than just callbacks. It was more than just like references. It was like a continuation of their stories, of their continuity. That was, I so appreciated. That's what was most unexpected. I mean, like in today's times of crossovers and stuff, I would have expected cameos. And I kind of went in expecting like, well, we'll probably get some kind of cameos toward the very, very end. But like these guys were in the entire third act. And it was great. It was great. Especially if you're familiar with those movies, you know. Let's see here. He also says in talking when Tom Holland's Spider-Man asks, it was Garfield's Spider-Man, I think. I don't know. Somebody asked him if they had anyone special. Garfield said no. You know, he'd just kind of given up on that, which made sense. I think that was the right move to not say, yeah, I found a Mary Jane and we're in love, you know. But no, even though years have passed in his timeline, he has not found anyone else. Maybe he isn't even looking for anybody else, you know. But Maguire's Spider-Man doesn't say, well, does he say MJ? I can't remember. What he says is we're making it work, you know. You don't get the sense that like he had this happily ever after ending. You get the sense that he's still Spider-Man in his world, and he's still kind of, struggling with life and problems and stuff. I did love the moment. This is kind of off of that topic thread, but when Garfield asks, so are you gonna suit up when we go out, or are you just gonna stay dressed as a cool youth pastor? So I love the youth pastor reference. But I also did wonder, as like of the two that they're bringing back, he's certainly the oldest. I have no idea what kind of physical shape he's in, and you know, when you put him in the suit, they probably did some padding here and there, you know, or maybe some digital slimming. Who knows what they did? But regardless of whatever they did or didn't do, you could still tell this is not like, he is not really sculpted like he was when he made those movies, you know. But at the same time, I didn't require him to be. He's an older Spider-Man, and you don't have to be buff in order to be super strong. That's what the spider bite was about, you know. Otherwise, his muscles would have to be as big as this room, you know. So anyway, but I loved how they just implied the continuation of his story and his struggles and stuff like that. They just seem to understand and respect the strengths of what these other films went for and utilize those strengths here. Okay, so there's a potential tease. Actually, I think it's almost certainly a tease that we are eventually going to get Miles Morales in these Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. In the last scene with Electro, when Electro sees his Spider-Man, Garfield, without a mask, he's kind of disappointed. He's like, you know, you're living in Queens and this and this. I just thought you were going to be black, you know. And he kind of shakes his head and says, man, there's got to be a black Spider-Man out there somewhere. And of course, fans know, yes, there's a very successful iteration of Spider-Man using a character named Miles Morales from the Ultimate Spider-Man universe, who's now been integrated into the main Marvel Comics universe. And there's been a really successful animated film about him called Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, which I haven't seen, but I may want to see eventually. There's a Miles Morales Spider-Man game, which I love, you know, and so almost certainly it would be cruel and foolish of them to make that reference without plans to bring Miles Morales into these movies at some point in the future. And my son pointed out to me on the drive home that in the first movie, Spider-Man Homecoming, one of the guys that was working with the Vulture was a black guy who ended up being the Prowler or something. I'll have to watch that again because I don't really remember that. It sounded vaguely familiar, but like he ended up being I don't know if they called him the Prowler by name, or if fans would just be able to figure out based on his civilian name, which maybe they said in that movie, and his reference to having a nephew, that he was the uncle of Miles Morales. And so there is a Miles that is the nephew of this guy somewhere in the Spider-Man universe, you know, in these movies. So I think those two things combined indicate that we are going to get a Miles Morales in the future, and I think that's a great idea. Personally, I'm predicting that as they're going to there'll be a little bit more of a gap between this Spider-Man movie and the next one compared to the previous Spider-Man movies. And when we come back, we'll have a new trilogy where he's in this different stage of life, and it'll be about that stage of life and the different whatever supporting cast he is or isn't surrounded by. But I'm thinking maybe they'll introduce photography, like he'll start doing photography for the Bugle. And somewhere in the middle of that trilogy or the end of that trilogy, I think, is when they'll introduce Miles Morales and eventually have Peter pass the torch. And then that will either be something that just caps off the Spider-Man movies and the MCU will be rebooted at that point, or if they have time before another reboot, then we could maybe get a Miles Morales trilogy or something. But I've long felt, since I saw that they cast Tom Holland so young and were doing this Spider-Man trilogy being set in high school, I was like, they could get at least 6 movies out of this actor, and I hope they do, because I would love to see both the high school phase of Spider-Man and the young adult phase of Spider-Man. Heck, I would even enjoy seeing a 30 or 40 something Spider-Man. Maybe he'll start taking a background role if we get to a Miles Morales trilogy or something like that. I don't know, but I think there's still a ton of longevity and potential for the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, and Miles Morales could be a very big part of those. Let's see here. Let's see, Spidey's, what does my notes here say? Spidey's connection to the MCU is positioned to be greatly de-emphasized. Which I should have put that somewhere else. I think that if they do kind of separate him from the MCU at this point, that's a terrible move. Maybe not for Sony, but that's going to be real bad news for me and fans like me that are keeping up with the MCU at this point, because we are scraping the bottom of the barrel. I know a lot of people like Shang-Chi, but who the heck is Shang-Chi compared to Captain America and even Iron Man? Yes, Iron Man was not a household name at all when they made that movie, and it was a great movie, and then he became a household name, But I don't think the same thing's going to happen for Shang-Chi, or the Eternals, which I haven't seen yet, but has not been getting good reviews. And so they cannot get the X-Men and Fantastic Four, which they've acquired the rights for now, they cannot get them into the mix soon enough. And I think in the meantime, Tom Holland's Spider-Man needs to do what Iron Man did between Spider-Man movies, and that is pop up in other MCU movies and just be the glue that keeps people invested in the MCU as a whole, keeps a feeling of connection between these different properties and stuff. Nick Fury can't be that glue anymore. I think Samuel L. Jackson's getting too old for that, or maybe disinterested. Who knows? But I think Spider-Man should be that, and I know that it'll take a lot more work in the boardrooms between the people making deals, and that'll cost a lot. It will not be very cost effective, but I think just from an audience perspective, exclusively, that would be really a thing that would be good for them to do right now. Let's see, there's a post-credits scene where Venom pops back into his world. There was a post-credit scene at the end of Venom Let There Be Carnage where he pops out of his world and into another. The news comes on, and he sees the report that Spider-Man has just been revealed to be Peter Parker. And so we realize, okay, crap, he's in the MCU or the Tom Holland verse or whatever you want to call it. So he was left there at the end of that post-credit scene. Then in the post-credit scene for this one, he is still in the same bar, and he's kind of learning about the world that he's in. And then he's like, okay, well, maybe I should go see this Peter Parker. And then he phases out, he teleports out, because, I don't know, I assume Doctor Strange ported him out, it was part of, it looked like he was phasing out as part of the same effect that transported the other characters back to their own continuities. But that doesn't explain how he got there to begin with, because the spell that Doctor Strange cast caused people who knew Peter Parker was Spider-Man to come into this world. In Venom's world, he has no idea who Peter Parker is, let alone that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. I don't think he even has a Spider-Man in his universe, And so how he got to the MCU is still a major question that I don't even know if they're going to bother answering at this point, because that only happened in the post-credit scene of his movie, and then he got ported back, presumably in the post-credit scene of a totally different movie. So I don't think they're going to really write their stories requiring that viewers have definitely seen the post-credit scene. You know, as much as they tease things and connect things that way, the core stories of these movies do not depend, I don't think, on you seeing every single one of those post-credit scenes. So, anyway, he does leave behind a drop of the Venom liquid, which says to me, okay, so that seems to be teasing at least a black suit story for the next or a future Tom Holland Spider-Man movie, which sounds about right. I think you could do a whole movie that is just about Tom Holland's Spider-Man and the black suit and have a different villain, not have Venom be in that movie, but have Venom be in a follow-up movie. But then who's that Venom going to be? Is it going to be Tom Hardy? I don't know. They're trying to make him way too likable to really function as a villain for Spider-Man. And they also ported him out of the universe there. All they did was bring in the liquid goop, which is a weird choice to do. Maybe they just really wanted to tell a Venom story or tell a black suit story, but they didn't want to have to make two Venoms. It's weird. Yeah, it's very strange. There's also the recent Morbius trailer, it was pointed out to me, featured headlines referencing Rhino and Black Cat. Rhino and Felicia Hardy, who is Black Cat, were in Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, you might think nothing of that because, hey, Rhino and Black Cat are in all kinds of other Spider-Man comic books and video games and stuff like that. But this recent Morbius trailer also included an Oscorp building being shown that had the exact same Oscorp logo design from the Amazing Spider-Man movies. What the crap? Now, granted, I am thrilled with how much they respected Garfield's Spider-Man story arc and how they continued that arc in a sense in this movie. And the totally unrealistic fanboy in me would want to say, oh my gosh, they not only respect those movies, they love them, they're going to revive that franchise. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous thing even saying that. I'm like, they're not going to do that. You telling me they're going to they're definitely not going to switch from Tom Holland to Andrew Garfield and stop doing Holland Spider-Man movies in favor of doing Garfield Spider-Man movies. I mean, enough time has passed that he is old enough that, like, he could maybe do one or two more Spider-Man movies. I don't know. I mean, we think of Spider-Man especially as such a youthful character that I don't know how much more Spider-Man you can get out of Garfield as, like, the main Spider-Man. But could they create an alternate continuity Spider-Man or Spider-Verse where Garfield is the main Spider-Man in that? There was talk of there being a Sinister Six movie or a movie focused on villains after the Amazing Spider-Man movies in which Garfield's Spider-Man would be in them, but he would not be the main focus. Is it possible that Sony is trying to kind of revive that Garfield Spider-Man universe, telling us that Tom Hardy's Venom and Morbius are a part of that? Well, that's confusing because the Morbius trailer also shows that Michael Keaton's Vulture character seems to be a part of that universe, which would seem to put Morbius in the MCU. Well, it's all, after watching this movie, you know, and seeing what they did with Electro, where yes, he is Garfield's Electro, but he's also kind of not. Something happened to him. Is this really literally supposed to be the same Electro that was in Garfield's Spider-Man movie? Because his personality seems changed too. Not just, all he says was, I got my body back. But he doesn't really explain his whole personality overhaul. And so I was thinking through most of the movie, I think he and Andrew Garfield are not necessarily literally the same characters as in those amazing movies. They're just a very close parallel reality or something. They can say whatever they want. When you're messing around with parallel realities and introducing it this much, and depending on audiences accepting this much of the concept of the multiverse and parallel realities, then, you know, they could go any number of directions. But it's so weird. It's so weird. Now, I don't think this is realistic, and I don't even think this is what's going to happen. But I would love for Andrew Garfield to play Spider-Man more. I would love some kind of not necessarily a solo Spider-Man movie where it's just him, but because I think that's totally beyond reasonable. But maybe something in the Sony Spider-Verse. Maybe he could be Spider-Man in the Sony Spider-Verse, and Sony will make deals to have Andrew Garfield continue to be the MCU Spider-Man. I don't know. It's so weird. So weird to have that Oscorp logo revive that. What are they doing? What are they doing? So this is one of those things that, like, I don't think we should give too much weight to it and dream too much, because it's just so weird what they're blending together. I think it's better left as something that we'll just find out when we watch the special features of some future movie that is in that like a Morbius special feature, or some other future movie hasn't even been announced yet that will be connected in some way and will explain, oh yeah, people were wondering back in the day when we had the Oscorp logo in the Morbius movie or whatever. So I'm curious about the explanation, but I think it's just so weird what they're doing now that we shouldn't get too hyped up or attached to any one theory, because anything is possible at this point. It's so wacky. I don't think that, from an audience perspective and a business strategy perspective, I don't think it would make sense to have both a Garfield and a Holland Spider-Man franchise, both of them, running separate and parallel to each other. But man, this is a weird world we live in, getting weirder all the time. Tobey Maguire naturally looks older to me, and he references back issues, as does Garfield, but it seems to be more pronounced in Maguire's Spider-Man. And I love this idea of a Spider-Man that's entering his 40s or 50s or however old Tobey Maguire is now. I wonder to myself, could all this weirdness, all these parallel things, these mixed multiple realities, somehow lead to a live-action version of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which I have not seen. It won, I think, an Academy Award or something. I mean, it was very well received. I've heard it's just fantastic, and I've just never gotten around to it. But I've heard that it's fantastic and that it has an older Peter Parker, like a 40-ish, 50-ish Peter Parker in it, that the main Miles Morales Spider-Man kind of meets and interacts with or something like that, and maybe is kind of a mentor. So I don't know. I should really watch that movie. But that being the case, assuming that's the case, and I heard that correctly, and because it's such a celebrated movie, I think it's plausible. Anything's possible. I think it is somewhat plausible that they could be wanting to lead toward a live-action adaptation of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and maybe Tobey Maguire could play that older Spider-Man, or, depending on how long it takes him to get there, Andrew Garfield could play that older mentor Spider-Man. No idea. I really expected Maguire's Spider-Man to die from the wound that was when he was stabbed in the back. Kind of give him the classic hero's end, like, here we are, here's the Spider-Man actor who started it all, here's the version of Spider-Man that started it all in terms of live-action movies, and now we're going to bring it full circle and bring his story to a definitive close, and I wonder if that was maybe part of the plans at some point, and then they adjusted the script to have him survive that, because all it would take was a little bit of reshooting, a few last-minute changes before they shoot to adjust that scene so that he lives. He didn't do much after that. He just stuck around for a little while and then teleported out when Doctor Strange reset things, So it may be that they wanted to give him that hero, that self-sacrificing hero moment, and kind of have their cake and eat it too and keep him alive, so that at least they would have the option available to have him appear in some kind of future Into the Spider-Verse type of situation. But I don't know. Anyway, those are all the things I could think of to jot down really quickly, spoilery type stuff that I could react to. Would love to get your thoughts and reactions to all kinds of spoilery stuff in the comments below. But those are all of my thoughts for now. Thanks. Bye-bye.